All right, hello, welcome everyone to Star Trek from the Holodeck. This is the Star Trek Enterprise edition. I am Michael, your host and captain of the USS Rayman Digital. On the bridge with me is the one and only David Sabal. Hello.
Hello, everybody.
I should say Ensign David Sabal.
Ensign. Okay.
Yeah. Well, we need to leave some room for advancement. Promotion, or demotion. What's beneath Ensign?
I don't know. Well, you know what?
Crewman,
because I think that brings me down to the lower decks, which is where I belong.
unlisted officer. Yeah.
Enlisted officer. Advisor. I become
Consultant.
Consultant.
All right. So we had left off, David, talking about Star Trek Enterprise, and we weren't talking about any specific episode. It was more of a catch-all.
Yeah.
Feelings, thoughts on Enterprise and its evolution, and just, 20 plus years later, our thoughts on it. But where we had left off, we were talking about the divisiveness. There were a lot of things that just didn't work out well, or at least work out how the producers originally had intended. Now, obviously, looking back, Enterprise is a Star Trek series that's just fine. Is just fine. However, at the time when it was airing, there were those problems because they were doing a lot of different things. The producers wanted to be ambitious, and that's what a lot of these divisive choices ended up becoming. They were characterized as ambitious, and sometimes ambition pays off, David, and sometimes it doesn't. Mm-hmm. That's why at times the ambition didn't pay off, because that's why it resorted to throwing Trip and Archer in little blue underwear and having them run around the ship near naked a lot of the times. And then you show T'Pol in a cat suit. I mean, these are things that they had to do because at times the ambition just wasn't paying off in terms of ratings.
Yes.
So when we look back at this retrospectively, though, I don't look, and this is largely what we were talking about during our first discussion, I don't look back at this series as appalling. I actually look back at it far more favorably than I did when it was airing.
Well, because when we actually take a look at Enterprise now, the one thing I will say about Enterprise, especially the first couple seasons, is you get a fully fleshed out idea of a story. Mm-hmm. There's no idea that basically when I've gone through my rewatches of Enterprise, I don't get the sense that basically I'm imagining like the writers in that writing room just throwing shit at the wall and trying to see what sticks. They come in with a game plan and say, "Hey, this is our story arc. This is what we're going to work with. Here are the characters that we're going to be working with. Let's stick to our guns."
Yeah.
The only time you ever get a sense that Enterprise feels broken is actually in the end of their final season.
You're talking about the season finale or the series finale
itself?
Yeah,
the last couple episodes of the series finale, because at that point, it feels like everything is disjointed, everything is rushed.
So not the last few episodes. You mean the actual season, the series finale.
The series finale.
Yeah.
Because it feels like, and it's understandable in hindsight now when we look historically, because we all know that they got their legs cut out from underneath them because they were told, "You guys got canceled. Sorry, you're not going to get another season."
Yeah, see you later.
And it's kind of like, okay, well, what do? We had these game plans, and I'm sure that the writing room had a lot of game plans for a following season, and suddenly we don't have it.
Yeah, and we'll get into that. We'll get into those season 5 plans. But you are right, David. Even though this show might have had some of its problems because of its desire to be ambitious, to have a kind of a stripped down portrayal of this era, kind of like, what does the world of Star Trek look like prior to the polish look of the Utopian Federation?
Yes.
What does it look like prior to that Utopia, I should say? What does the path to Utopia look like? And in that regard, Enterprise stuck to its guns. And that's why, looking back, you don't see a fragmented series. Ideologically, conceptually, it does feel intact. You feel that there's one mind behind it. And yes, sure, we know how television works, David. We're not naive. There are pivots. You have to pivot. That's largely the reason why season 3 changed its format a bit. You know, where it went from episodic to straight up serial, or I would say a serial hybrid is what we were calling it during our last discussion.
Yeah.
I mean, that change was directly informed by the ratings that weren't doing very well, the feedback they were getting from Star Trek fans. But even though they changed the format, they didn't change the idea behind the series. And that's why the series like this, when you contrast it with, say, Discovery, even though I love Discovery for the good things that it does do, there are a lot of inconsistencies because that series suffered from an identity crisis from the very beginning. You had a new showrunner. I think by the time they moved into season 3, they had already had 4 showrunners. So the problems with Discovery, when you contrast it with Enterprise, it's very different. There isn't that feeling of an identity crisis with Enterprise. You can feel, if you know what to look for, changes. They were pivoting, you know, making sure they can keep their series on the air. But even with those pivots, Enterprise feels consistent from episode 1 until the very end. Of course, that series finale is just a disaster. And unfortunately, that will always be a part of Enterprise's legacy. But that is the worst series finale in all of Star Trek, David.
Oh, easily. It is the number 1 of the worst Star Trek.
And then they kill Trip. What? And why? Trip was one of the not one. He probably, David, him and DePaul were probably the two. I know they were always forcing Archer to be the Kirk, to be the Picard, to be the Benjamin Sisko. But the reality of it was the characters that people gravitated to mostly was Trip and DePaul.
Yeah, because especially the way he dies too.
What? How can you do that to him?
He like literally dies trying to save people. And I'm like going, why? Yeah. What was the point of actually doing that? And it would have been one thing, and this is like just my own fan rage about the end of that character, because I did really like that character as I started watching the series.
Yeah.
You have him die to a bunch of randos. Instead of, if you want him to die, fine. Have him die because of T'Pol. Because that's your narrative thread.
Yeah. Well, he didn't he die saving her or no? I can't remember now. We'll have to go back. Let's put a pin in that. And listeners out there, I'm sure you'll tell us very quickly if we fucked up and we're wrong. But you are right, David. Either way, whether he died protecting T'Pol or he didn't, the point is that how do you take one of the better characters and you shrug and say, yeah, fuck it, let's kill him.
Let's kill him.
And then, because the show's coming to an end, there's no moment to mourn him.
Yeah.
Even Tasha Yar, who was in only the first season, really, of TNG, her legacy lived on through the entire series.
And I know that there's Star Trek fans that are like adjusting their glasses right now and going, but excuse me, they released a novel saying that Trip survived and he secretly faked his own death to join Section 31. Yes, I read the novel.
Yeah.
But guess what? The novels for Star Trek fans everywhere, I guarantee you 50% of them have not read the novels.
Yeah, no, more than
religiously
50%.
as us.
More than 50%.
So to all Star Trek fans,
or less
majority,
than 50%, I should say.
Trip is dead.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and plus tie-in media, it's not canon.
It's not canon fully.
Yeah. But I will say, David, if I were ever given the reins to Star Trek, the first thing I would do is like, hey, you guys like time travel, right? I'm gonna go save Trip. And I'm gonna make that book reality. God damn it!
And the best part by far, you had a Section 31 movie.
Yeah, you could have did it there.
You could have done it there.
All right, so let's talk about the potential season 5. If Star Trek Enterprise was not canceled, season 5 was already mapped out. They already knew the general direction they were going into. into. Now, I'm not saying that they had the episodes written. What I'm saying is they had the general idea of what they wanted to do. And if Enterprise had been renewed for a 5th season, the producers planned to explore the Earth-Romulan War, which is a pivotal conflict in Star Trek history that ultimately led to the formation of the Federation. Now, producer and the showrunner for season 4, Manny Koto, had stated in interviews that the war would have been a major focus and elements were already being set up in the series' later episodes, which we saw. We saw them working on that.
Mm-hmm.
The Romulans had been subtly manipulating interstellar politics and Enterprise, apparently is the direction they were going to be going in, particularly in episodes like Minefield. If you remember that episode where the Enterprise had its first encounter with a Romulan minefield. Now, the only problem with this, David, is that it could be a problem, but it could have been something really cool. In a lot of ways, they could have turned this series into almost a version of Deep Space Nine, a variant of Deep Space Nine, meaning it would have taken on a bit of a Cold War aesthetic.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because they don't know what the Romulans look like.
Exactly.
So it would have been an enemy in the shadows. How awesome would a season of Star Trek would have been? How awesome would a season of Star Trek like that would have been?
Oh, yeah, because for us as Star Trek fans, yeah, we know what the Romulans look like. But you also have to remember, in the original series,
it wasn't until that
moment they actually said, oh, they look like Vulcans.
What's that episode? I forgot the name of the episode, but we've talked about this episode before.
Yeah.
Strange New Worlds played with that particular episode a little bit. It was where Kirk had to be the awesome naval captain.
Yes.
And go up against a Romulan vessel. And when they had seen inside the Romulan vessel, they all noticed that, wait, what? It looks like Spock.
Yes.
They have pointy ears. And then that's when we first were introduced technically in terms of canon
to the Romulans.
To the Romulans and what they look like.
Just imagine that though, Mike. So you bring back a beloved, quote unquote, alien villain race that we all as Star Trek fans know. And the entire season revolves around setting up this mystique of the Romulans. Dude, you could actually have a really awesome story without showing the Romulans and just basically showing how manipulative they truly are, which we all know as Star Trek fans, that's how they function.
Yeah.
And so it would be so much fun because you would get almost kind of like a Cold War spy. You could get like a spy film noir type of vibe from it, especially now looking in hindsight. And, you know, we just had a moment of me just yelling at the sky about the death of one of my favorite characters in Trip. But like, if the game plan was to actually fake Trip's death and then he becomes like this agent for Section 31 to kind of combat the mysterious Romulan enemy during the final season.
Which character? I missed
Trip.
It. Oh, Trip. Well, we
But
also had
supposed to be
Malcolm.
it.
You got to remember, Malcolm was already alluded to, I want to say in season 4, that Malcolm was a member of Section 31 prior to his commitment to the Federation, or I should say to Starfleet.
So imagine that, Mike. We could have had a season focus on those two as they tried to combat this mysterious shadow syndicate of the Romulan Empire. Come on, that sounds really cool. And yet, unfortunately, instead we get a holodeck program of Will Riker going, yes, I want to study the original crew of the Enterprise.
Yeah. Dude, so just to get a little more context here, so in Star Trek canon, the Romulans were in isolation for 53 years before their return in the Star Trek The Next Generation episode, The Neutral Zone, which aired in 1988. So yeah, they were a mystery. Mm-hmm. People didn't really know what they were about, really. We knew that they were this unseen threat. And in a lot of ways, I would even argue back in the 60s that it was a metaphor or an allegory for the Cold War. They were enemies that we didn't know who they were. We couldn't locate them. This feels a lot like a metaphor for communism as well. Like,
yeah.
who are the communists that are infiltrating? We don't know who they are. They blend in.
Who do you trust?
But who do you trust? So there was a lot of political awesomeness that was just imbued into this idea to begin with. And that's why, David, years ago when I heard about this potential season 5, it just made me sad. Like, we missed out, especially, David, we can all agree that Enterprise improved drastically moving into season 3.
It did.
So if it
did.
improved drastically and season 3 and season 4 were so strong, imagine what season 5 would look like.
Mm-hmm. Because that's why I said the tragedy of it all is, like, even though everyone kind of bemoans the ending of Enterprise, you can only bemoan the final episode, because that's what ruins everything.
Yeah.
I mean,
it really does. And I know some people, and I don't know if producers have pushed back on this, but because of that series finale that basically was a holodeck episode where Deanna Troi and Riker were watching the events of the formation of the Federation unfold.
Don't remind me. I'm trying to figure this out. Why?
Okay, so I always assumed that was just that episode. But you mentioned something years ago that you had just assumed that the entire thing was actually just a holodeck reenactment.
Yeah.
I never looked at it that way. But when you said that, I was like, motherfucker, I hope that's not really what it is. That would be dumb. See, I always assumed it was just that finale, that the series finale was framed that way because they had no other way to get to that moment. Because technically, the real series finale was prior to the events of the Terran Empire episodes.
But here's the problem, though, Mike.
A Mirror Darkly, part 1 and 2.
Darkly, yeah.
Because those are the 2 episodes that preceded the series finale.
The problem with the concept of what they did at the Enterprise, that type of ending ruins an entire series. I mean, if you look outside, look outside Star Trek, there's that old. The name eludes me, but it's that one TV series that is about a hospital. And it ends with, you find out the whole story revolves around this autistic kid that is looking at a snow globe. And the hospital's inside the snow globe. And we're supposed to actually walk away saying, oh, all the stories we've seen is in this mind of this child looking at the snow globe. I can't remember the name of it, but it's an infamous television ender where it shows there are concepts that you do not play with in television.
Yeah.
And it essentially, Enterprise decided we're going to play with that concept and see if it works, because we're canceled, so we don't know anything else. So we got to go with that trope that basically everything was a holodeck program.
Well, what do we do, guys? I mean, we had Trip walk around in little underwear numerous times. We can't do that again.
And then we blew him up.
Okay, David, so while you were talking, I looked up some information here. So the producers have only framed the Enterprise series finale, These Are the Voyages, as a holodeck recreation, not the entire series. The episode takes place within a Star Trek The Next Generation timeline, such horseshit, where Commander Riker explores a holodeck simulation of the Enterprise NX-01 crew's final mission. This framing device led to heavy criticism, of course, as it distanced the episode from Enterprise's own narrative and reduced its character's agency. Exactly. Now, Brannon Braga and Rick Berman have since acknowledged that the finale was a massive misstep, but this is the answer, David. They never claimed the entire series was just a holodeck program, only that the last episode presented a retrospective, not a retcon of the entire show.
But here's the thing.
But that's their words. That doesn't mean it's not interpreted the way you interpreted.
That's the problem. I looked it up, and it's the series that I'm talking about originally is St. Elsewhere.
Oh yeah.
St. Elsewhere ends with a small child looking at a snow globe, and you find out that all this freaking series revolves around this child's mind looking at the snow globe.
Yeah.
And like essentially they went with that ending for Enterprise. And I get it. You say that it was only supposed to encompass that final episode, but the concept itself basically so broad, widespread for fans. They're like going, so the whole fucking series was a holodeck episode.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's that. That's the problem with that concept of trying to say it's all a dream.
Yeah, well, this gets into areas of meaning and intent, because who
Yes.
creates the meaning?
Who
You
creates
you
the
can argue and
meaning?
say the authors create meaning, but there are multiple other theories out there that suggest that the real meaning makers are the audience themselves. That once the author puts that out there, it's up to the audience to create the meaning and what is actually being said and done. So if more people like you are saying, or I should say, if most of the audience, most of the fan base is saying what you are saying, that, well, I mean, it kind of is saying this. Where does it say that the rest of this is not a holodeck?
Exactly.
How do we know that? We don't.
We don't.
Who's to say that Riker hasn't been watching all of this unfold in the holodeck? So there is a point to be made that we could be watching nothing but a holodeck recreation, and that's why I choose never to watch the series finale. David, I
Yes.
don't watch it. It makes me mad.
It makes you
Especially because I see Deanna Troi in her stupid outfit.
and just come in and start talking to Will as if he's reading a book.
Yeah. Oh, I'm just up here right now. Checking out the don't make
When they
David, a lot of there's not a lot of things that make me mad in Enterprise, but that just always
dude.
just gets under my skin.
it does, especially in the very beginning, because they open up with the fucking thing.
It's also just a big FU to Enterprise. Like, hey, you know what? The agency is going to be placed on TNG characters. Really, they had their time.
They had their time, and that's the sad part is like they rake it. Essentially, that final episode
Okay, David,
treats
imagine
all the characters poorly because they're saying that they're not as important as the TNG characters.
Yeah. Imagine if they did that with Next Generation, and the series finale was Kirk and Spock telling a story.
That was so funny. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if they did that even by today's standard? If Discovery ended like that,
Oh.
you have Spock suddenly just going, "Ah, yes, we found these lost documents of Burnham.
Well, and this is what happened to Burnham.
This is what happened to Burnham."
That's so bad. All right, David, so let's shift gears a bit and let's look at the individual myth arcs, meaning the overarching storylines that governed and created coherence in each and every season. So season 1, as we were talking about in our first part, David, it wasn't until season 3 where they had a myth arc similar to, say, Deep Space Nine,
Yeah,
where they went to that format again. Season 1, season 2 largely operated like the original series and TNG. There were connective aspects, like to be continued, and I would say some of the emotion, at least with TNG, the emotional impact did stay with our characters to a degree, but not like with what they did with Deep Space Nine and even Voyager moving forward. So the main myth arc in season 1 is a combination of a few different things. So you had the temporal Cold War. That was probably the biggest aspect of the first season. It started things off in the first episode, and I believe it bled over into the series, or I should say into the season finale itself. So with Cold Front, which is the episode dealing with the temporal Cold War, it reveals that crewman Daniels is an actual time traveler monitoring history. Okay? So that was one story arc. Then you had humanity's first steps into deep space. I wouldn't call that a story arc, though. I would argue that's more of a theme. I mean, yes, the theme was used to tell stories about humanity's first steps into deep space, but would you argue that is a viable myth arc or just a part of the story? Meaning, isn't that part of the series premise? What's the distinction between story arc and series premise?
that's the tough part with that one.
Yeah. So then you have the Vulcan human tension. I would say that's thematic as well as an arc.
That's thematic because that started since season 1. I mean, like,
Well, yeah, season.
the whole point of Archer in his very beginning is the fact that he does not trust the Vulcans because he believes that the Vulcans are holding back humanity.
So you would say that's thematic as well as part of the story arc.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So temporal Cold War and Vulcan human tensions. Those are the two governing story arcs and themes that most of season 1 is built around. And those are cool concepts. They really are, David. Like when you go back, season 1 got a lot of shit, but when you look at the temporal Cold War and how they took things that so the temporal agents, not the Cold War aspect. Again, I could be wrong.
But the idea
of temporal agents was introduced in Deep Space Nine.
Yes.
When Dax, Worf, O'Brien, Bashir, and Cisco went back in time.
Yes, to the original series.
Era.
That was actually cool.
Yeah. And then at the end of the episode, you had those temporal agents instructing them not to talk about the events of the past. And what did you do? Did you do something that might have changed something? But it wasn't until Voyager. Voyager is what fleshed out, really, the temporal Cold War.
Oh, yeah. And if you think about it, the whole temporal thing even traveled into Kurtzman's era because you had the temporal agents or the temporal Cold War continue on in stuff like Strange New Worlds and even in Discovery toward the end when you find out freaking
Daniels, yeah.
Daniels is like the guy that's basically been watching this whole thing. And that's one of the reasons why I loved the reveal that Daniels is the one that's basically helping Burnham. And it all makes sense because the temporal the temporal agents are there to be kind of like guardians.
Yeah.
They're there to make sure, hey, this has to happen or these things have to be put back into place. And when you think about like how they're used, they're almost like they're kind of like stand-ins for Star Trek like story writers that basically say, hey, if we need something to literally happen in Star Trek that affects the overall narrative, you insert the temporal agents.
I think
that's why having Daniels come in Discovery made so much sense, and it made it so much more impactful for Discovery because think about it. Discovery's story is about Burnham going into the future and having to rebuild the Federation. Yeah, temporal agents would say, yeah, that's kind of like an important thing. We need the reestablishment of the Federation. Let's step in for a little bit and kind of help them along. and why Daniels, like when you get to the reveal of Daniels actually saying, yeah, I've been helping the Federation and the Enterprise this whole time because the Federation's important.
So David, you bring something up that this is why you and I get along. I never thought about. When you said that the temporal war, as well as the temporal agents, kind of operate as stand-ins for writers.
Yeah.
David, you're right. I never thought about that way. That is an interesting way. It's a meta approach to writing an episode that allows every writer from any series to say, we're going to change some things, and we're going to use the built-in mechanism that not only allows you to, but also because the way the temporal wars were established and the temporal agents, that it allows them to create fuckery without breaking things. Yeah. Because they literally said, I forgot which episode of Star Trek it was, where they mentioned that this can happen. We allow this to happen because this particular time travel moment that broke time was supposed to happen.
Yes.
So they can go in there and just say, yes, that's supposed to happen. And that's why we allow it to happen. It's a genius way to fucking cheat.
Yeah.
And you're right, David. It is one of the most well-used writing devices in Star Trek.
If you think about it, and they only bring it up when it's something super important to Star Trek's history.
Yeah.
Like, let's take Strange New Worlds, for example. When the temporal agents show up, it's only when you have Pike question his destiny. And everyone under the sun basically telling Pike, this is how it has to happen.
Yeah.
And what happens at the very end of Strange New Worlds? Oh, temporal agents show up and tell Pike, yeah, you need this to happen. Unfortunately, that wasn't Pike.
Oh, no,
that wasn't Pike.
That was Pike talking to Pike. You're talking about Leanne's episode.
Leanne's episode,
in the second season, right?
Sorry, yeah, Leanne's episode, where she's literally told this has to happen. And it's one of the more powerful moments because that character is told she cannot be happy.
Well, and they also change literal Star Trek canon, but the way they do it, I wasn't a big fan of that, so we're not going to get into it too much because I don't have all of those facts. I need to rewatch that episode, but I remember they did do some things where they pushed some of those dates back, and it doesn't necessarily work well with established canon. But again, if you look at how they set up time travel and the way the temporal agents and the Cold War operates, then it could very well work.
Yeah, because time, remember me and you talked about it in that episode, how time is fluid.
Yes, it's not fixed.
It's not fixed.
Yeah. All right, so the main themes continue for season 1, the challenges of early space exploration, as we mentioned, humanity's place in the galaxy, which is a part of that, optimism versus realism in First Contact, specifically in the episode Dear Doctor, which debates whether to interfere in another species' natural evolution. We talked about that during our first discussion. And then cultural misunderstandings. In the episode Sleeping Dogs, it shows how humans misread Klingon survivalist customs. So there's a lot of interesting things going on with season 1, both in terms of writing, in terms of culture, in terms of politics. Very smart, actually, when you look back. It's very smart how they worked all those different elements into the first season. You also have the world-building contributions, which we talked about that a little bit during our first episode as well. You had the Vulcan Society. The episode specifically titled Fusion explores Vulcan emotional suppression and alternative philosophies, which is one of my favorite episodes. Starfleet's early policies, in the episode I believe titled Detained, introduces Starfleet's first ethical debates on internment camps and political neutrality. The Andorian-Vulcan rivalry is another big theme and aspect in another world-building contribution. Not a theme, a world-building contribution. The Andorian and Vulcan rivalry. Major alien species and their roles. This is all first season, by the way.
This is all
For
first
all
season.
those people that say the first season's garbage, you have the Suliban. We get to see the origins of the Andorian relationship with Starfleet, which to this day, I never, David, let me backtrack before I say to this day, I never cared about the Andorians. I thought they were silly looking, like blue people with antennas.
Antennas.
It was like the perfect representation of what we thought aliens might look like Martians in the 60s.
And then now think about it, Mike. One of our favorite characters in Strange New Worlds was Andorian.
Yes. I had said that Trip and T'Pol were the best characters. And arguably, yes, they were. And Archer, I don't want people thinking I didn't like Archer. I just think they struggled a bit.
Yeah.
To make certain things work for him. And he definitely became a stronger, much better character towards the end of the series. And one of those things, David, that kept him interesting was actually the introduction of the friendship with Shran. Shran, in a lot of ways, is what saved Archer for me. Their relationship, the two of them, their camaraderie, the diplomacy they worked out amongst themselves, regardless of their own individual governments. Mm-hmm. They chose to defy orders at times, both of them, to work together and to save each other. Awesome story. And also it makes sense when we know from Star Trek canon that one of the first species to join the Federation Charter was the Andorians. Mm-hmm. Along with the Vulcans. So it was very interesting to see how they weaved all of those various story elements beginning with season 1. All right, so let's move into season 2. The main myth arcs, overarching stories, the escalation of the temporal Cold War. Shockwave Part 2 confirms multiple factions are in fact manipulating time. You also have the increasing tensions with Vulcans and Andorians. Starfleet struggles with cultural sensitivity. Episodes highlight For example, humanity's early misunderstandings of alien customs, very strong ethical episodes. Some of the main themes, ethical dilemmas of Starfleet missions, they definitely crack open that ethics book for the season 2, without a doubt. Prejudice and mediation, limits of human adaptability. For example, the catwalk episode shows how little preparation Starfleet has really when it comes to long-term deep space survival. It shows truly how naive humanity was to think, we're ready. We're ready for deep space. Never mind solar flares and radiation that we don't even have fucking shields. We have polarized the hull. What is that? That's not even shields.
That's not shields. And that's the thing, is kind of like the one joke that me and you have always reoccurring whenever we talk about Enterprise is that moment when, I believe it's T'Pol, like looks at Archer and tells him, and not exact words, but basically says, what did you expect when you came out here and just waving at everyone? And me and you always joke about how Archer is naive.
Mm-hmm.
But in season 2, that's one of the core concepts.
Yeah.
Is like, humanity thinks they're prepared for space travel when they don't realize this is your first shot here. You're in unknown territory. You're going to have bumps in the road.
Mm-hmm.
And while it leads to a lot of jokes and snickering on Archer's behalf and a lot of actually the early Federation officers, it brings up a very true philosophical idea that basically I think gets overlooked a lot of times with people, is like, when you enter an area that is unknown to you, you don't own the house, so to speak. You're entering someone else's house. So you have to be mindful of where you go.
Yeah.
You don't own where you stand.
Yeah, that's some of the best parts of Enterprise, Dave.
Yeah.
Like, there is a moment, I don't know if it was in season 1 or season 2. And if it was in season 2, then it's very early on. But there's a moment where Archer just feels, this is one of the stronger moments for his character, where he's completely disillusioned.
Yeah.
Because he realizes that they weren't prepared for any of this, that they were also nearly destroyed by this alien species. Yes. And he said, this is not what I thought this was going to be like. And you know what that is, David? Enterprise gets a lot of shit from film scholars and film activists, people who go back retrospectively and write, film theorists who focus more on activism than actually what's happening in the show itself. And they've attacked Enterprise for being almost like slipping back into almost into a 1980s Reagan aesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
Like, meaning they handle politics like the 80s handle politics. And I completely disagree with that. If anything, let's say it's Reagan 80s aesthetic is more about stripping those layers back and showing the mistakes that human society has made in those steps of colonialism, where we think people view things and think things the same as we do from the West.
Mm-hmm.
And our culture in the West is vastly different than the other cultures. So in a lot of ways, that's what the first 2 seasons of Discovery was doing. It's showing the dangers of Eurocentrism. In a lot of ways, that's what they were doing in order to create an allegory for the very first steps, or I should say even dealing with U.S. Geopolitics and how we approach things from a Eurocentric view.
Yes.
So, David, again, Enterprise is not nearly as shitty as people like to say it is. There's a lot of cool things going on just in the first 2 seasons. Look at everything we've gone through. Prejudice and meditation, I already said. Limits of human adaptability, I already said. First contact misjudgments. Vulcan and Torian conflict. Some of these things are being pulled over from the first season. Starfleet development. We start to see Starfleet beginning to understand itself, its potential, what it wants to be. The Orion Syndicate. We see aspects of the Orions resurface. You have major alien species also introduced, the Tellurites. We also get that deeper look into the politics of Vulcan society. And then, of course, the Klingons.
Yep.
Season 3, you have the Xindi arc, which,
That's the big one.
yeah,
I think, for Enterprise.
I think the power of Enterprise, say it really finds itself, I would say. I think Star Trek Enterprise really finds itself in season 3 because also there's a lot of passion involved because this is post 9/11. And that in a lot of ways is what the Xindi war or the Xindi storyline was geared around, dealing with the passions, the prejudice that acts of violence can generate amongst people, even people who are not prejudiced. Look at Archer. Archer is one of the most nicest, soft-spoken captains in all of Star Trek, and even he had to face his prejudice in season 3 because of what happened. This is the reality of war. War takes peaceful men, takes people who are not prejudiced, and often imbues them with a type of prejudice because they are angry with the violent actions taken against their fellow man, their fellow brotherhood. And that's another thing that season 3 really delved into. Trip also, a lot of his emotion. It got a little annoying towards the end, hearing him talk about Florida constantly. But
He loves Florida.
but the point was clear. They're trying to show how prejudice can find itself in people who have shunned prejudice. Prejudice in this world, in this fictional world of Star Trek, David, as we all know, has been stomped out. It's been rooted out at least as it pertains to humanity. So to see that rearing its ugly head in Star Trek is a very real thing. It's a very real thing. Did we not all face the same thing after 9/11? What happened? A lot of people may not know this, but prior to 9/11, Middle Eastern individuals, this is why I always say race is made up. Race doesn't exist. Ethnicity exists. Race does not. We recategorized Middle Eastern people from white. They were considered white. They were racially recategorized to something completely different. They were considered white, but after 9/11, we recategorized them. I'm talking officially, not in our minds. It was actually done at a government level.
Yeah.
We recategorized Middle Eastern people as non-white. So these things happen, Dave, in societies that have fought against prejudice, have fought against racism. And that was the power behind season 3. And as we go through these discussions, I challenge all of you. And I not challenge, you know what? I urge everyone to go back as we discuss these episodes and watch the episodes with us. And I want to see if you guys are noticing these things. And also, if there are things that you notice, please share with us.
Especially when the Xindi do get introduced.
Yeah.
Because that concept in itself is something that I don't think we've ever saw up to that point in Star Trek, because the Xindi aren't just one race. They were a collection of races. They were a collection of, I think, 5 or 6 other alien races.
Yeah.
That fought the Federation. So it wasn't like the normal issues that Archer had to face in the prior seasons, where it was like, okay, I have to deal with Klingon customs. I have to deal with or not the Romulans, but the Andorians and the Vulcan customs. The Xindi were just a group of alien races that just did not like humans.
Yeah.
They did not like the fact that we humans were treading on their territory.
But also, interestingly, David, staying true to Roddenberry's, one of his core tenets of Star Trek was the idea of communication being at the center of conflict. And yes, Enterprise Season 3 was influenced by the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And the storyline reflects themes of fear, retaliation, and the complexities of responding to an existential threat, which was in fact mirroring the national and global climate following 9/11. But David, if you remember, not even the Xindi were necessarily, they weren't painted as evil.
Yeah.
There was miscommunication. They were being manipulated by forces from the future. So at the center of this conflict wasn't diabolical behavior. Yes, it was near genocide, wiping out a lot of Florida. But my point is that at the center of that conflict was miscommunication. They acted, the Xindi preemptively struck the humans because they were told that they were going to be annihilated later in the future.
Yes.
So at the center of that entire war, which there were fans that complained that why is Star Trek going back to war? Didn't they learn their lesson with Deep Space Nine that Star Trek isn't about war? I'm like, well, you are right. Star Trek isn't about war, but man, you're really not understanding the story of Deep Space Nine, nor are you understanding the story of Enterprise
right
Season
now.
3.
Yeah. Especially since when you look at the totality of like what first and second season tried to establish, you get to season 3 and it comes full, it comes full circle with the whole idea that humanity is not ready for what's waiting for them out in space.
Yeah.
And the Xindi is the culmination of that.
Yeah, and yes. And I mean, that harkens back also, besides the communication aspect, it also harkens back to something I read years ago. And I forgot which Roddenberry book it was because I read tons of them, where he said that one of his ideas when he was working on the early drafts of Star Trek was this idea that, yes, humanity is not perfect. So, yes, they might have evolved, right, to a point where they have greater empathy, greater powers of empathy, greater critical skills, but they're still human. We're still imperfect. So that requires constant work, constant reassessment to make sure that we're not losing sight of our progress as a civilization. And Roddenberry said a lot of the conflicts that you see in Star Trek isn't about the conflict itself. It's about that we must learn to live together. That's at the core of almost every Star Trek idea, is that, yes, we may mask my theme. Let's say my theme is we must learn to live together. So in order for us to push that idea forward, we have to create stories that involve conflict, that involve war. Mm-hmm. Not because we're condoning war, not because we're saying Star Trek is about war, but so that we can reassert the notion that we live on one planet and we must all learn to live together despite our massive differences in both, obviously, the obvious difference in appearance, but also the difference in ideology. The difference in morality. So Enterprise takes that and really makes it work. Some of the main themes: preemptive war and ethics, as I was saying, psychological cost of war, fragility of diplomacy, faith and war. And then, of course, the world-building contributions were just astronomical. The Expanse, which I loved.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole idea of the Expanse, the Xindi Council, the military development. You had Zadi Prime shows Enterprise undergoing major weapon upgrades. Time travel's unpredictability. What else? We had, alien species, right?
Yes.
Okay, we had the Xindi, obvious. We had the Sphere Builders, which just awesome, which was connected to the Expanse itself. And then you had the Arconian. And then season 4, David. The road to the Federation. So you have United, which brings Andorians, Tellurites, and humans into an alliance. And then the Vulcan Reformation, which is where the writers worked through all of those growing pains that we were introduced to in the first seasons of Enterprise with the Vulcans, like learning a better way of doing things, essentially, is what that story was about. Weeding out the corruption and the prejudice that had found itself rooted strongly in the Vulcan upper echelons. Then you had the Klingon augment virus, which was awesome. What a great way to explain the difference,
Yes.
the different Klingon appearances.
Yes.
Only for Discovery to fuck it up again, but
to really
but
fuck it up.
I'm waiting for that future Star Trek series to justify that fuckery. Eventually, right? They should fix
Eventually.
it. Although, if you want to believe what Lower Decks did, they kind of implied that Discovery was in a different timeline.
Yes.
And watch the series finale of Lower Decks
To get that.
to catch that little clue nugget there. What else did we have? We had the rise of xenophobic Terrans. That was an interesting
Yes.
story arc, David. Wasn't RoboCop at the front of that?
Yeah. Oh my god, I forgot the
Peter-
actor's- Peter Weller.
Yeah,
Peter
dude,
Weller.
he's so good.
And-
oh shit, he was in Into Darkness.
And he's Into Darkness as the.
Was he the same character? No, I don't think he was the same person.
I didn't realize that till now, and that's
I
amazing.
didn't notice it either until I just said it out loud. I was like, oh yeah.
So he was Paxton in
Okay.
Enterprise.
So you played two different characters.
Yeah, and he played Alexander Marcus in
Yeah,
Into Darkness.
the father of Carol.
Carol Marcus.
Carol Marcus, yeah. Okay. Man, I thought we just, stumbled upon something by accident.
Something by accident, but no, yeah. They're two different characters, even though they kind of are similar in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, Peter Weller kind of plays, even though I love him to death, he's a bit of a character actor. He plays similar roles, right?
Yeah.
Typically.
But yeah, that my mind almost got blown there because thinking about it, I'm going, holy shit, wait a minute. Is Peter Weller a major character in Star Trek?
Now, some of the main themes in that final season, necessity of alliances, Vulcan philosophy shift, which is one of my favorite episodes of Enterprise. I believe the episode titled Awakening is what really pushed that idea forward, and it introduces Surrock's true teachings, which is what we are familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Genetic engineering consequences, the augments, that's what you mentioned during our first discussion.
Yeah, with Noonan Sung.
Yeah. World building contributions, Vulcan reformation, a reformation, birth of Starfleet diplomacy, the Terra Prime movement, which was interesting. Mirror universe world building. I wouldn't really consider you know what? Let me backtrack. They did explain a lot of things. You know what? Yeah.
Yeah, the mirror
That's
universe,
world building. Yes.
Yeah, the mirror universe played a decent role in Enterprise.
I would argue that Enterprise's mirror episodes were probably some of the best. Up until what Discovery did a pretty good job with it.
Discovery did a good job.
Unfortunately, the first season was it suffered from not knowing what it wanted to be.
Well, the difference between how Discovery used it and Enterprise used it, Enterprise used the mirror universe episodes to really flesh out Archer. It used it to flesh out Archer's character.
Do you think they were trying to say something about the darker side of these characters?
Yeah, the darker side of the characters.
Now we know they always do that. Yes, this is the darker fate that potentially could happen. Blah 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 blah. But I think it was something a little more strategic here in these episodes, which we'll wait
until we
get to it to fully delve into it. But I do feel like they're doing something very different than other series have done with the mirror universe. So that pretty much wraps up the major story arcs.
And that's a lot.
Themes, world building contributions. And now we're ready to move into our first episode discussion, which will be available hopefully in the next couple of weeks for our listeners. David, is there anything you want to add to this discussion before we close out about Enterprise? Something that we probably should have mentioned, but I had forgotten?
Nothing major that we've already discussed in kind of like a teaser post.
Mm-hmm.
But to tell you the honest truth, the one I'm really interested to cover with you is the Augment War. Because that's when it got really dark and Enterprise started to go places that I didn't think Star Trek would dare go to, because it challenges the utopian ideal of what Roddenberry saw humanity.
Yeah. And also this is why I love Star Trek, because Star Trek has always been great at posing like what ifs and making us look at things from another perspective, because even though the augments have been characterized as being evil and bad, right? Since the very inception of the characters, right? Or conception of the characters.
Yeah.
But Enterprise was trying to show something a little differently with them, like with the augments, and try to frame them as almost like victims a little bit, some of them.
And it really helped build more understanding with characters outside of Enterprise's, I guess you could say, scope, because like now with the augment race, we look at characters like we look at characters like Khan differently now.
Yeah.
Because we understand, his superior intellect is fantastic, But it's the fact that one of his biggest traits was Khan is not empathetic. Why? Well, look at the race that he comes from. They weren't very empathetic. That's the one drawback to their race, is that they lack the human empathy that is clearly an important trait that Roddenberry feels is important to establishing what Star Trek Utopia is about. Without empathy, you cannot communicate. And we know that basically communication is very key in actually any of the philosophy in Star Trek, what makes Star Trek Star Trek. So if you remove that, that's almost kind of like the worst sin you can create as a person, is like a person who lacks empathy.
Yeah. It's a strong episode, or strong string of episodes, for sure. And it's going to be interesting to go back and look at these different arcs, because season 3 and season 4 were just filled with really interesting arcs. I loved what they did. Now, what they did was a little different than other Star Trek. So even though they went back to, you could say, the Deep Space Nine format, they also did something a little different than Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine had a major revolving arc that they would touch on throughout their 20-plus episode seasons, right?
Yes.
Maybe 8 episodes would be tackling the myth arc. Enterprise did this really cool thing in the 4th season where they did 3 or 4 episode story arc installments. So every 3 or 4 episodes was a new story arc. And they had the main myth arc still, but they also had little arcs within the big ones.
Yes.
And that made Enterprise season 4 really strong and innovative, because there wasn't really a lot of TV shows tackling that type of writing back then.
Because you had like a lot of really great, you had the opportunity to really see the strength of that writing room, because they had to come up. It's kind of like what you mentioned earlier about the strength of what Sherlock and Benedict Cumberbatch and that series that on BBC had. It was this short little increment of episodes that told a bookend story. Here in Enterprise, we got that multiple times throughout the season, and it created like this really cool, I can watch these 3 episodes as one cohesive story and then move on to the next one. But it still affects the characters along the way and creates like this really cool dynamic character growth for a lot of the characters, and not just Archer. That was the amazing part too, because in season 4, you really saw the growth of characters like Malcolm and Trip.
Yes, Dave, especially with Malcolm, because Malcolm was it's funny because the first season I struggled with him quite a bit.
Because he was like one note.
Yeah. And they also portrayed him as a bit of a creep at times. Like just kind of a dude that just was always looking to get his dick wet.
Yeah.
It didn't matter where he went.
Yeah.
He was gonna fuck someone. And I'm like, that's just weird, dude. And it wasn't.
Is it Mike? I mean, come on.
I mean, technically, I guess that is an accurate interpretation of men in general.
I mean, if we go out into space, there is a part of our brain that basically goes, can I fuck it?
David, I don't want my dick to fall off. I don't know what alien like viruses they have. Like, I'm not going to be Trip and be the first human male to be impregnated.
But if they look like T'Pol, you know.
Now that's
if they look like
that's a conundrum.
If they look like Seven, you know, I might be willing to make the sacrifice.
Really? You might allow your dick to fall off if it meant one time with
7 of 9.
Okay, well,
come on.
I can imagine there might be other men that would say the same thing.
Exactly.
That's all I got to say. Let's close out today's show because we're already past an hour. So let's cut it off now, David, before it gets out of hand. I want to remind everyone that you can find additional discussions from us over on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/RainmanDigital and pledge, you can gain access to a plethora of discussions. We're going to be doing additional Enterprise discussions that are going to be posted just to Patreon. It'll be under the $1 tier. So if you want more of those discussions, you can pledge $1. If you want access to all of our additional bonus Star Trek discussions, then you do have to subscribe to the $5 tier, which is the podcast tier, where we do a lot of various Star Trek discussions and whatnot. So thank you, David.
Thank you. Live long and prosper.